Chapter 1 of Galactic Patrol. Galactic Patrol by E. Smith. Chapter 1. Dominating twice 100 square miles of campus, parade ground, airport, and spaceport, a 90-story edifice of chromium and glass sparkled dazzlingly in the bright sunlight of a June morning. This monumental pile was Wentworth Hall, in which the Tellurian candidates for the Lens of the Galactic Patrol live and move and have their being. One wing of its topmost floor seethed with tense activity, for that wing was the habitat of the lordly 5-year men. This was graduation day, and in a few minutes Class 5 was due to report in Room A. Room A, the private office of the Commandant himself, the dreadful lair into which an undergraduate was summoned only to disappear from the hall and from the cadet corps, the portentous chamber into which each year the handful of graduates marched, and from which they emerged, each man in some subtle fashion changed. In their cubicles of steel the graduates scanned each other narrowly, making sure that no wrinkle or speck of dust marred the black and silver perfection of the dress uniform of the patrol, that not even the tiniest spot of tarnish or dullness violated the glittering golden meteors upon their collars, or the resplendently polished ray pistols and other equipment at their belts. The microscopic mutual inspection over, the kit boxes were snapped shut and racked, and the embryonic lensmen made their way out into the assembly hall. In the wardroom, Kimball Kinnison, captain of the class by virtue of graduating at its head, and his 3 lieutenants, Clifford Maitland, Raoul LaForge, and Waddell Holmberg, had inspected each other minutely and were now simply awaiting, in ever-increasing tension, the 0 minute. "Now, fellows, remember that drop," the young captain jerked out. "We're dropping the shaft free, at higher velocity and in tighter formation than any class ever tried before. If anybody hashes the formation, our last showing with the whole corps looking on." "Don't worry about the drop, Kim," advised Maitland. "All 3 platoons will take that like clockwork. What's got me all of a dither is what's really going to happen in Room A." "Uh-huh," exclaimed LaForge and Holmberg as one. "You can play that across the board for the whole class," Kinnison agreed. "Well, we'll soon know. It's time to get going." The 4 officers stepped out into the assembly hall, the class springing to attention at their approach. Kinnison, now all brisk captain, stared along the mathematically exact lines and snapped, "Report!" "Class 5 present and full, sir." The sergeant major touched a stud at his belt, and all vast Wentworth Hall fairly trembled under the impact of an all-pervading, lilting, throbbing melody, as the world's finest military band crashed into "Our Patrol." "Squads left, march!" Although no possible human voice could have been heard in that gale of soul-stirring sound, and although Kinnison's lips did not move, his command was carried to the very bones of those for whom it was intended, and to no one else, by the tight beam ultra-communicators strapped upon their chests. "Close formation! Forward! March!" In perfect alignment and cadence, the little column marched down the hall. In their path yawned the shaft, a vertical pit some 20 feet square, extending from main floor to roof of the hall, more than 1,000 sheer feet of unobstructed air, cleared now of all traffic by flaring red lights. 5 left heels clicked sharply, simultaneously upon the lip of the stupendous abyss. 5 right legs swept out into emptiness. 5 right hands snapped to belts, and 5 bodies, rigidly erect, arrowed downward at such an appalling velocity that to unpracticed vision they simply vanished. 0.6 of a second later, precisely upon a beat of the stirring march, those 10 heels struck the main floor of Wentworth Hall, but not with a click. Dropping with a velocity of almost 2,000 feet per second, though they were at the instant of impact, yet those 5 husky bodies came from full speed to an instantaneous, shockless, effortless halt at contact. The drop had been made under complete neutralization of inertia, free in space parlance. Inertia restored, the march was resumed, or rather continued, in perfect time with the band. 5 left feet swung out, and as the right toes left the floor, the second rang, with only bare inches to spare, plunged down into the space its predecessor had occupied a moment before. Rank after rank landed and marched away with machine-like precision. The dread door of Room A opened automatically at the approach of the cadets and closed behind them. "Column right, march!" Kinnison commanded inaudibly, and the class obeyed in clockwork perfection. "Column left, march! Squads right, march! Company, halt! Salute!" In company front, in a huge square room devoid of furniture, the class faced the ogre. Inspector General Fritz von Hohendorf, commander of cadets. Martinet, tyrant, dictator. He was known throughout the system as the embodiment of soullessness, and insofar as he had ever been known to show emotion or feeling before any undergraduate, he seemed to glory in his repute of being the most piteously rigid disciplinarian that earth had ever known. His thick white hair was roached fiercely upward into a stiff pompadour. His left eye was of glass, and his face bore dozens of tiny thread-like scars, for not even the marvelous plastic surgery of that age could repair entirely the havoc wrought by the lethal rays of space combat. Also, his right leg and left arm, although practically normal to all outward seeming, were in reality largely products of science and art instead of nature. Kinnison faced, then, this reconstructed potentate, saluted crisply, and snapped, "Sir! Class 5 reports to the Commandant." "Take your post, sir." The veteran saluted as punctiliously. As he did so, a semicircular desk rose around him from the floor. A desk whose most striking feature was an intricate mechanism, surrounding a splint-like form, so shaped as to receive a man's left arm. "Number 1, Kimball Kinnison," von Hohendorf barked. "Front and center. March! The oath, sir." "Before the omnipotent witness, I promise never to lower the standard of the Galactic Patrol," Kinnison said reverently, and baring his left arm, thrust it into the hollow form. From a small container labeled Number 1, Kimball Kinnison, the Commandant shook out what was apparently an ornament, a lenticular jewel fabricated of hundreds of tiny dead white gems. Taking it up with a pair of insulated forceps, he touched it momentarily to the bronze skin of the arm before him, and at that fleeting contact a flash as of many-colored fire swept over the stones. Satisfied, he dropped the jewel into a recess provided for it in the mechanism, which at once burst into activity. The forearm was wrapped in thick insulation. Molds and shields snapped into place, and there flared out an instantly suppressed flash of brilliance intolerable. Then the molds fell apart, the insulation was removed, there was revealed the lens. Clamped to Kinnison's brawny wrist by a massive bracelet of imperishable, almost unbreakable metal in which it was embedded, it shone in all its lambent splendor. No longer a whitely inert piece of jewelry, but a lenticular polychrome of writhing, almost fluid radiance, which proclaimed to all observers and symbols of ever-changing flame that here was a Lensman of the Galactic Patrol. In similar fashion, each man of the class was invested with the symbol of his rank. Then the stern-faced Inspector General touched a button, and from the bare metal floor there arose deeply upholstered chairs, one for each graduate. "Fall out!" he commanded, then smiled almost boyishly, the first intimation that any of the class had ever had that the hard-boiled old tyrant could smile, and went on in a strangely altered voice. "Sit down, men, and smoke up. We have an hour in which to talk things over, and now I can tell you what it is all about. Each of you will find his favorite refreshment in the arm of his chair. No, there's no catch to it," he continued, in answer to amazedly doubtful stares, and lighted a huge black cigar of Venus-grown tobacco as he spoke. "You are Lensmen now, and henceforth each of you is accountable only to himself and to GHQ. Of course you have yet to go through the formalities of commencement, but they don't count. Each of you really graduated when the lens was welded around his arm. We know your individual preferences, and each of you has his favorite weed, from Tillotson's Pittsburgh Stogies up to Snowberg's Alsaconite cigarettes, even though Alsacon is just about as far away from here as a planet can be, and still lie within the galaxy. We also know that you are all immune to the lure of noxious drugs. If you were not, you would not be here today. So smoke up and speak up. Ask any questions you care to, and I will try to answer them. Nothing is barred now. This room is shielded against any spy ray or communicator beam operable upon any known frequency." There was a brief and rather uncomfortable silence. Then Kinnison suggested diffidently, "Might it be best, sir, to tell us all about it from the ground up? I imagine that most of us are in too much of a daze to ask intelligent questions." "Perhaps. While some of you undoubtedly have your suspicions, I will begin by telling you what is behind what you have been put through during the last 5 years. Feel perfectly free to break in with questions at any time. You know that every year 1,000,000 18-year-old boys of Earth are chosen as cadets by competitive examinations. You know that during the first year, before any of them see Wentworth Hall, that number shrinks to less than 50,000. You know that by graduation day there are only, approximately, 100 left in the class. Now I am allowed to tell you that graduates are those who have come with flying colors through the most brutally rigid, the most fiendishly thorough process of elimination that it has been possible to develop. Every man who can be made to reveal any sign of weakness is dropped. Most of those are dismissed from the patrol. There are many splendid men, however, who for some reason not involving moral turpitude are not quite what a Lensman must be. Those men make up our organization, from grease monkeys up to the highest commission officers below the rank of Lensmen. This explains what you already know, that the Galactic Patrol is the finest body of intelligent beings yet to serve under one banner. Of the 1,000,000 who started, you few are left. As must every being who has ever worn or will ever wear the lens, each of you has proven repeatedly, to the cold verge of death itself, that he is in every possible respect worthy to wear it. For instance, Kinnison here once had a highly adventurous interview with a lady of Aldebaran II and her friends. He did not know that we knew all about it, but we did. Kinnison's very ears burned scarlet, but the Commandant went imperturbably on. So it was with Volker and the hypnotist of Caroline, with LaForge and the Bantlameters, with Fleawelling when the Ganymede Venus thionite smugglers tried to bribe him with 10,000,000 in gold. "Good heavens, Commandant!" broke in one outraged youth. "Didn't we do any real work at all?" "Plenty of it, but at the same time each of you underwent enough testing to prove definitely that you could not be cracked. And none of you need be ashamed, for you have passed every test. Those who did not pass them were those who were dropped. Nor is it any disgrace to have been dismissed from the service before graduation into the patrol. The 1,000,000 who started with you were the pick of the planet, yet we knew in advance that of the selected 1,000,000, scarcely 1 in 10,000 would measure up in every essential. Therefore it would be manifestly unfair to stigmatize the rest of them, because they were not born with that extra something, that ultimate quality of fiber which does, and of stern necessity must, characterize the wearers of the lens. For that reason not even the man himself knows why he was dismissed, and no one save those who wear the lens knows why they were selected, and a member of the patrol does not talk. It is necessary to consider the history and background of the patrol in order to bring out clearly the necessity of such care in the selection of its personnel. You are all familiar with it, but probably very few of you have thought of it in that connection. The patrol is, of course, an outgrowth of the old planetary police systems, and until its development, law enforcement always lagged behind law violation. Thus, in the old days following the invention of the automobile, state troopers could not cross state lines. Then, when the national police finally took charge, they could not follow the rocket-equipped criminals across national boundaries. Still later, when interplanetary flight became a commonplace, the planetary police were at the same old disadvantage. They had no authority off their own worlds, while the public enemies flitted unhampered from planet to planet. And finally, with the invention of the inertialess drive and the consequent traffic between the worlds of hundreds of thousands of solar systems, crime became so rampant, so utterly uncontrollable, that it threatened the very foundations of civilization. A man could perpetrate any crime imaginable without fear of consequences, for in an hour he could be thousands of light years away from the scene, and safely beyond the reach of the law. And helping powerfully toward utter chaos were the new vices, which were spreading from world to world, among others the taking of new and horrible drugs. Cyanide, for instance, occurring only upon Trenco, a drug as much deadlier than heroin as that compound is than coffee, and which even now commands such a fabulous price that a man can carry a fortune in one hollow boot heel. Thus our patrol came into being. At first it was a pitiful enough organization. It was handicapped from without by politics and politicians, and at the same time it was honeycombed from within by the usual small but utterly poisonous percentage of the unfit, grafters, corruptionists, bribe-takers, and out-and-out criminals. It was also hampered by the fact that there was then no emblem or credential which could not be counterfeited. No one could tell with certainty that the man in uniform was a patrolman and not a criminal in disguise. Slowly the patrol perfected itself. One of the greatest advances came with the invention of the lens, which, being proof against counterfeiting or imitation, renders identification of all lensmen automatic. The patrol then set up its own military courts and executed the few of its members guilty of misconduct. Standards of entrance were raised ever higher, and when it had become evident that the patrol was, to a man, incorruptible, it was granted more and ever more authority. Now its power is practically absolute. Its armament and equipment are the ultimate. Its members can follow the lawbreaker wherever he may go. Furthermore, a lensman can commandeer any material or assistance, wherever and whenever required, and the lens is so respected throughout the galaxy that any wearer of it may be called upon at any time to be judge, jury, and executioner. Wherever he goes, upon, in, or through any land, water, air, or space, anywhere within the confines of our island universe, his word is law. That, I think, explains what you have been forced to undergo. The only excuse for its severity is that it produces results. In the last 100 years, no wearer of the lens has disgraced it. Any questions about the lens, for instance? We've all wondered about the lens, sir, of course, Maitland ventured. The outlaws apparently keep up with us in science. Boskonian himself is supposed to be a genius, and to have surrounded himself with a scientific staff second to none in the known universe. I have always supposed that what science can build, science can duplicate. Surely more than one lens has fallen into the hands of the outlaws. If it had been a scientific invention, it would have been duplicated long ago, the Commandant made surprising answer. It is, however, not essentially scientific in nature. It is almost entirely philosophical, and was developed for us by the Arisians. Yes, each of you was sent to Arisia quite recently, von Hohendorf went on, as the newly commissioned officers glanced at each other in dawning understanding. What did you think of them, Murphy? At first, sir, I thought that they were some new kind of dragon, but dragons with brains that you could actually feel. I was glad to get away, sir. They fairly gave me the creeps, even though I never did see one of them so much as move. They are a peculiar race, the Commandant went on, essentially antisocial, or rather supremely indifferent to all material things. For hundreds of thousands of generations they have devoted themselves to thinking, mainly of the essence of life. They say that they know scarcely anything fundamental concerning it, but even so they know more about it than does any other known race. While ordinarily they will have no intercourse whatever with outsiders, they did consent to help the patrol for the good of all intelligence. Thus, each being about to graduate into the patrol is sent to Arisia, where a lens is built to match its individual life force. While no mind other than that of an Arisian can understand its operation, thinking of your lens as being synchronized with or in exact resonance with your own vital principle or ego will give you a rough idea of it. The lens is not really alive, as we understand the term. It is, however, endowed with a sort of pseudo-life, by virtue of which it gives off its strong, characteristically changing light, as long as it is in metal-to-flesh circuit with the living mentality for which it was designed. Also, by virtue of that pseudo-life, it acts as a telepathy through which you may converse with other intelligences. even though they may possess no organs either of sight or of hearing as we know those senses. It also has other highly important uses. The lens cannot be removed by anyone except its wearer without dismemberment. It glows as long as its rightful owner wears it, and it ceases to glow in the instant of its owner's death. Also, and here is the thing that renders impossible the impersonation of a lensman, not only does the lens not glow if worn by an impostor, but if a patrolman be dismembered and his lens removed, that lens kills, in the space of minutes, any living being who attempts to wear it. Its pseudo-life interferes so strongly with any life to which it is not attuned that life force cannot exist in this plane. A brief silence fell, during which the young men absorbed the stunning import of what their commandant had been saying. More, there was striking into each young consciousness a realization of the stark heroism of the grand old lensman before them, a man of such fibre that although physically incapacitated and long past the retirement age, he had conquered his human emotions sufficiently to accept deliberately his ogre's role, because in that way he could best further the progress of his patrol. "I have scarcely broken the ground," von Hohendorf continued. "I have merely given you an introduction to your new status. During the next few weeks, before you are assigned to duty, other officers will make clear to you the many things about which you are still in the dark. Our time is growing short, but perhaps we have time for one more question." "Not a question, sir, but something more important," Kinnison spoke up. "I speak for the class when I say that we have misjudged you grievously, and we wish to apologize. I thank you sincerely for the thought, although it is not necessary. You could not have thought otherwise of me than as you did. It is not a particularly pleasant task that we old men have, that of weeding out the unfit. But we are too old for active duty in space. We no longer have the instantaneous nervous responses that are for that duty imperative, so we do what we can. However, the work has its brighter side, since each year there are about 100 found worthy of the lens. This, my 1 hour with the graduates, more than makes up for the year that precedes it, and the other oldsters have somewhat similar compensations. In conclusion, you are now able to understand fully what kind of mentalities compose our patrol. You know that any creature wearing the lens is in every sense a lensman, whether he be human or hailing from some strange and distant planet, a monstrosity of a shape you has as yet not even imagined. Whatever his form, you may rest assured that he has been tested even as you have been, that he is as worthy of trust as you are yourselves. My last word is this: men of the Galactic Patrol die, but they do not fold up. Individuals come and go, but the patrol goes on." Then again all martinet. "Class 5, attention," he barked. "Report upon the stage of the main auditorium." The class, again a rigidly military unit, marched out of Room A and down the long corridor, toward the great theater in which, before the massed cadet corps and a throng of civilians, they were to be formally graduated. As they marched along, the graduates realized in what way the wearers of the lens, who emerged from Room A, were different from the candidates who had entered it such a short time before. They had gone in as boys, nervous, apprehensive, and still somewhat unsure of themselves, in spite of their survival through the 5 long years of grueling tests which now lay behind them. They emerged from Room A as men knowing for the first time the real meaning of the physical and mental tortures they had undergone, men able to wield justly the vast powers whose scope and scale they could even now but dimly comprehend. End of Chapter 1.